Did you watch any of Crown Jewel?
I watched all of it. Yes.
You watched all of it. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to talk a bit about Crown Jewel, because I definitely had a lot of thoughts coming out of Saturday after we did the post show. And as well, they went into it a bit on WrestleNomics. And I have always kind of prefaced these shows when we get to them that I always struggle with them. I don't know what is the level, the type of coverage that people want out of these, that I want out of them. And I feel that we have gotten into this pattern that we did the initial show, the very first one, the Greatest Royal Rumble. Like, we went into that show, and then coming out of it, like, you and I had very similar feelings about, this is not a normal wrestling show. This is something else. And neither of us felt comfortable about reviewing this as just a wrestling show. We knew what this was and what this was not, and did a much different type of show later that year in 2018 after the Jamal Khashoggi murder. And
let me just say, like, for me, after the first one, I don't know if I was as much on that side of things. Like, I probably,
okay,
I was not necessarily for them, but like, I think I accepted them maybe a lot more than I certainly did after, the Khashoggi murder and everything. So I feel like I kind of grew my awareness of everything to do with Saudi Arabia as this whole experiment or this sort of deal with the WWE and the government went along.
So that was sort of how we approached those ones. And then we, it started like there was a removal. They continued on with these. We had the pandemic. So there was a period of a year and a half where they did not go over there. They returned last October. And so they have done now 3 shows since the pandemic has ended, quote unquote. And we're at a point now where this is 8 shows in, and I think more than ever, and this was reflected in how the WWE approached this show over the weekend, that it is safe to go back in the water, so to speak, that we are going to treat this show this past weekend as our welcoming of the Saudi Arabian government, praise for Mohammed bin Salman. Like, they went full out here, and it is almost as though this has been just a, beat down your critics to just have either you do not watch these shows, it's out of sight, out of mind, or you're just conditioned that these are just another pay-per-view. These are not another pay-per-view. And that was my feeling overall coming out of the weekend, is that this is sport washing in practice. We are seeing it, and this is what happens. And do we kind of raise up these issues twice a year? I know that we are not going to be covering world politics on a weekly basis on this show, but I think for our sort of niche here, where this, and I separate these shows significantly from any other type of wrestling shows where you are being paid this level of money for twice a year, from where you are in business with the government. I see this as a much different deal than any type of wrestling show. And I think like there is that responsibility to be looking at these issues and sort of just assessing the coverage that these shows should have, because they have reached a point now where I think by and large people are just looking at these as the monthly pay-per-view, and certainly the company feels that way, to be as brazen as they were this past weekend, which was many steps towards what this was always intended to be and that they had shied off with for several years.
Mm-hmm, right. Yeah. It's a struggle, for somebody in our position. I think, at least, speaking for you and I, every time we come across one of these shows, how do we effectively cover it? How do we effectively do our jobs, which I would consider to be, show reviews, wrestling reviews, in addition to news? How do we balance the two, while I think satisfying both of those objectives? And I think, obviously we will lean more towards the news side when there is news, especially for the Khashoggi murder. And I think, in the case of like the press conference, I led the Friday show off with it, so I think when there's actual news, we will appropriately focus on it. But I also know my role here, and I think what the audience is also looking for is a discussion of the show itself. So I think we always try our best. Now, like when it comes to can you is there sort of like a responsibility to never focus on the shows and the matches themselves too much, without also maybe making a bigger deal out of like the politics of the entire deal, about the I don't know, numerous human rights offenses that still occur. That part might be a bit more difficult for me to answer. I suppose like I'm more of the mind that like when there's news to discuss, we will discuss the news. When there's wrestling to discuss, I mean, that's part of my job to discuss that as well.
Yeah, I think it's just it is very clear to most people like what the purpose of this show is. It is like this is a transaction, and what is expected of this roughly $50 million per show. And I think Friday gave you a pretty clear insight into what that $50 million is bringing to the government of Saudi Arabia, and this endorsement of this worldwide entertainment company that descends upon their country and places them on a pedestal to their audience and presents it as such. And I think like there has to be sort of those kind of checks and balances about what is the message here that is being either explicitly stated or heavily implied that these shows are designed to be conveying. This would not be a case of if you take away this government deal that WWE would be rounding up its crew, taping an edition of SmackDown a week ahead, and flying everybody over for what is a top tier like list of matches and talent that they are broadcasting on Peacock. And this would not be happening without that enormous amount that they are making for these shows, where they will bend over backwards, where they will stage an event the day before a SmackDown, even if that next day's episode is in doubt and you have to call up your NXT crew to fulfill your Fox contract. Like that is going to, these extremes to make sure these shows take place and that this transaction continues.
Well, of course. Yeah. I mean,
and this is it. This photo op is invaluable for what this is, for what is being seeked.
Yeah, like I would say content, outside of their usual sort of system is always, is going to go to the place where they can make the most money. And that would be an understatement when it comes to this particular deal. I believe Brandon Thurston had some sort of metrics, some sort of stats just kind of comparing a WrestleMania over its entire lifetime of WrestleManias
to 8 of these events since 2018.
Yeah, it's something ridiculous like that. I would hope that if you're listening to this podcast and if you've listened to kind of like, our coverage of these events by now and the coverage of WrestleNomics and people sort of like in our sphere, you already know the deal. Like these are people that are being paid to put on an entertaining show to effectively promote the name of Saudi Arabia. And I would say, obviously it's been certainly more subtle and more covert than it was that very first show where they showed that video package. They haven't done that yet, but it is getting back to that. It's headed towards that direction again. And I think, maybe most egregiously this weekend with, the thanking of the Crown Prince, the thanking of his excellency, bringing about his excellency onto the stage, where it was, I don't have his name in front of me, unfortunately.
Vince used to just remove one of your names, but they removed all of MBS's names.
I found that pretty peculiar too. The fact that they did not, Stephanie and Triple H did not by name say Mohammed bin Salman. And the MBS chant was not started by either Vince or Stephanie. It was started by this gentleman. I wish I had the name in front of me. I do not. But the representative, I would at least say, of the KSA government. So, I have to imagine they might not be so happy about their faces being attached to an MBS chant. That said, though, is there any mainstream press that is talking about this, like the fact that there was an MBS chant at a WWE?
I saw no critical response.
There's no hot water there right now compared to, the 2 years ago. And I think this probably gave them more permission to, go deeper into promoting Saudi Arabia and Riyadh and really kind of anything to do with, this entire, the point of this entire promotion the next time around.
Yeah. And I mean, they are at this point where, I mean, like Live Golf is such a huge topic of like whether they can secure a rights deal in the US that they would be willing to, like a US broadcaster would be willing to get into business with this golf league out of Saudi Arabia. And it's, you know, WWE, it's as much as it has grown, it can still fly under that rate. They are not going to receive that level of criticism. They did around
what sports league is though right now, John? You know, like again, we're a couple of years removed from the murder. F1, you know, freely goes there. I don't. Well, again, I wasn't really following like the live sort of like race at the time, so I can't necessarily say. Was also like a predicament where like they were actually experiencing like fire, you know, during one of their practices. So that probably received a bit more attention. But next time they go to Saudi Arabia, I doubt that there'll be too much of an outcry, you know. Like what sport would get that negative attention right now?
I mean, right now, like certainly I think with the World Cup coming up, like there is a lot of focus on that. But I mean, Fox is the broadcaster of the World Cup, and they have pretty much stated, like, if you're tuning into Fox, you are not going to be getting journalism into, like, they are presenting the soccer. Like, they're just flat out, we're not straddling this in between line of journalism and entertainment. It's like, you are here for the soccer, and we are just going to present the soccer, like pretty much putting their cards on the table. But there will be a lot of attention towards that. But you're right. Like, it is a lot more convenient for those to, you know, be in business here. And the criticism is, you know, save for a massive world event, which the Jamal Khashoggi murder was. And you had like Endeavor, Ari Emanuel, like did, you know, sizable, like cut off a deal with Saudi Arabia at the time. That was pretty significant at the time if you want to go and dive into kind of his personal politics at that time and what he went through. But that was where, you know, WWE they steamrolled through the controversy. Their stock was hurt, but they got through it. They got paid for that show and they moved on, and the criticism lessened after time. And that, I think it does wear down audiences. I have no doubt that there will be, you know, audiences of ours that don't want to hear about this all the time. I think sometimes though you have to put that aside, that not everything is just about being positively received, but certainly what is your role in covering all this. And I'll say I'm very happy with our track record of how we have covered these shows going back to 2018 and some of the people that we have had on. When we interviewed Brian Fogel, who directed the Dissident, that was to me a really enlightening interview and a documentary I would recommend to a lot of people if they have not happened to see it and really want the kind of nuts and bolts of that story from 2018.
So what would you suggest would be a solution, you know, the next time we have to cover one of these things? I don't know how you felt about the show you did with Kate on Saturday, but like, you know, would there be something you would do differently next time around?
I think that I think it's important for these shows to incorporate some element of sort of whether it is just what are the present news events that we should be aware of, what is going on here, what is the real progress that you are going to be told about on the air that is happening, like how does that hold up to the actual world standards and what is happening in Saudi Arabia. And I think that those shows are the platform that those kinds of conversations should be on and part of as well. So that's sort of how I look at them. And I kind of go back and forth between them. But I think this past weekend, to me, it indicates that this is what this deal was always intended to be. That first show was the most glaring. And I think if you did not have the Khashoggi murder, I think that this past weekend, this is more consistent with what these shows were intended to be and know full well where they are and that this is as much a commercial for the country as it is for WWE.
Yeah. Yeah. I think at the very least, you know, if you care about wrestling enough, if you're passionate about wrestling enough, you know, to listen to a podcast, to find a podcast like this, I would hope that you would at least have the awareness of exactly why these shows are taking place and that we all collectively try not to lose sight of it, you know, no matter how entertaining the shows was. And the show was entertaining. I thought it was a good show, John. But let's also remember the reason why it exists. And don't lose sight of don't get blinded by perhaps the shiny object to cover, you know, some of the realities of what's still going on.
Yeah, and I'm open to feedback too from people. And if you want to contact me privately, that's there's more than several avenues to do so. So I throw that out to people as well. But I thought it was important to kind of start the show just discussing that. And I was curious, actually, if you went back to watch the show,